1986 Mets and the 1969 Mets, um, both great teams, two totally different personality groups. I mean, what was your experience there?
Well, I mean, they were like night and day, and it starts right at the top with the manager. You had Gil Hodges, who was a taskmaster, a disciplinarian, and you had Davy Johnson, who was the ultimate players manager. Stay out all night if you want, but you better be ready to play the next day. And it wasn't past Davy to find players for making mental mistakes, because maybe they were out drinking or whatever the night before, and they didn't hustle or they made a mental mistake. Well, he would find them. So he was okay with treating his players like men, but you better be ready to play both physically and mentally the next day. And but as far as the players, of course, the '69 Mets, they had a bunch of characters. There's no doubt about it. But they, they came to play. Not a lot of hangovers on that team like you had on the '86 team, and the '86 team, they had a bunch of wild guys, and that played just as hard off the field as on. I mean, one of the guys I wrote a book with was Mookie Wilson, like we talked about, and he was really one of the very few that didn't partake in all the partying. But that also was a team that was full of bravado. The curtain calls and the brawls, and teams really, really hated the '86 Mets. And whereas the '69 team, there wasn't that hatred at all towards them. In fact, I think at a point, every team outside of Chicago probably felt that they were really good for the game in the country, because the United States at that time and much of the world was just going through a terrible time with the Vietnam War. It was really splitting the country, and you had anti-war protests, you had racial strife, you had equal rights, difficulties. I mean, there was so much bad going on in the world, and I think the Mets saw, the world saw the Mets as something to take their minds off of all the ills that were going on in the world at the time. And I mean, we've had people write us since our book came out after the miracle, people that were fighting in Vietnam, who, they would listen to the Mets games on the radio, and it kind of kept them going. So I'm sorry. So you got, the question about the '86 team and the '69 team, they could not have been more different in every way. The '69 Mets were universally loved, I think, except in Chicago, and maybe Baltimore. Whereas the '86 team was just despised outside of New York.
How about working with them? Was there a difference for you?
Both, um, the players from both those teams were phenomenal to work with.
Awesome.
I mean, the '86 team. I mean, you talk about surreal experiences, of being with Seaver and Kuzman, and how about being in Dwight Gooden's dining room, having him get emotional about some of his regrets and choices that he made, and how he could have arguably have gone on to become the greatest pitcher of all time. And as it was, I mean, he was almost 100 wins over 500, but how his addictions and his demons, kept him from maybe winning 350 games, and then going out to Missouri and going to Darryl Strawberry's house, and having him tell you how he turned his life around, and then some of the role players on that team like Danny Heap and Ed Hearn, how Ed Hearn, had a gun to his head and was almost going to end his life because, he was this rising star, really. He was Gary Carter's backup catcher, and then he gets, the next season after '86, he gets traded to Kansas City in the infamous David Cohn trade, and he's supposed to be the Royals. I mean, it was great. Catcher of the future, and just one malady after another, health wise, just living the life of Job, just horrible. And so his once promising baseball career, due to one health issue after another, leads him on the doorstep of committing suicide. Everything that happened with Wally Backman, and but they were all great guys to talk to. I mean, you think about all the brawling and how tough these guys are. Wally Backman's one of the nicest people I've ever dealt with. Lenny Dykstra is, he can be charming. He certainly is kind of out of this world, and it was the most bizarre interview I've ever had. But Lenny, he was terrific, and every time I've seen him since, he's been terrific. So yeah, those guys, and then of course the '69 Mets team. I can't say enough about every single one of them. They're just sweet guys, and they love talking about the '69 season and how much they meant to them. And so it's been a great experience. And you don't always get that with every player that you interview. And it's been said, never meet your idols because they'll usually disappoint you. But I must say that in the cases of the '86 and '69 Mets, that was certainly not the case at all. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with every single one of them.
You mentioned Mookie Wilson, and I was going to ask you, somebody like Mookie Wilson and Gary Carter, kind of the outliers of that '86 team. How did Mookie deal with all that craziness going around him, as far as the partying and the drinking and the everything else?
Well, I think he just separated himself from it. He knew it was going on, but he's told me many times that he would rather go to battle with a team like that than a team of milk drinkers, because they had a certain edge to them. And I mean, I think Bobby Ojeda in the book that I wrote said it best. I mean, they just didn't want to beat you. They wanted to burn down your village. They just had that take no prisoners. They didn't want to just beat you. They wanted to, beat the hell out of you. And it was just that killer instinct that I think made them so great. They absolutely dominated the National League in 1986. They won the division by over 20 games. They almost blew it in the championship series against Houston. I think if they had to face Mike Scott in Game 7, they probably would have lost. They don't say that, or at least they don't want to admit it. But I think that's what would have happened. But they were just a terrifically talented team, and of course, they almost blew the World Series too. But they came out of that. There was just something there. There was a little bit of '69 in that '86 team. There were miracles for sure. I mean, the way they pulled out championship series and then the World Series, it wasn't just talent, but there was certainly some other elements to it as well. And I think when you write books and you're looking for great stories, those are the things that you look for. You're not just looking, like, I often get asked, well, have I ever approached Derek Jeter? Because, I live in New York, and, Jeter is such an icon, of course. And, would you ever want to do a book with Derek Jeter? I get asked that a lot. And I'm like, of course I would, but I don't think it would be a great story because, he lived such a perfect life. He had such a perfect career. He won World Series. He was MVP of All-Star games and World Series, and And, he never got in trouble in New York. Could you imagine? I mean, we're living in the digital age, and, he was never on page six. And so I think a bad day for Jeter would have been tripping over some supermodel's pumps on his way to getting a cup of coffee in his kitchen in the morning. Like that's a bad day for Jeter, and so, but the 86 Mets and the 69 Mets, those are great stories.
And there's a good comparison with role players. I don't know if every championship team is like this, but even the 86 Mets, they had Backman and Tuffle at second base. They had Mookie and Lenny in the outfield. You had Howard Johnson, who's coming off the bench a lot. Kevin Mitchell, who you talk about in your book. Is that just a comparison between both those teams, or do you see that on a lot of other very good championship teams where you can just intermix players and they come out and perform?
Well, I think Gil started that in 69, and that's why the players, were disgruntled about it, because this wasn't common in baseball in 1969. In fact, I think part of Gil's genius was understanding that he had to get the most out of what he had, which really wasn't a particularly talented team outside of his pitching staff. I mean, you really didn't have any all-stars. Cleon Jones was the best position player by far. He hit, I think, 340 that season, but he was just coming into his own. He was not an all-star before 69, so Gil wanted to make the most of what he had, and I think that's why he used that platoon. And you talk about Art Shamsky. I mean, in the championship series, he started all three games and hit over 530, and was just destroying the ball. And yet, game one of the World Series, it's Swoboda starting in right field instead of Shamsky. And in fact, Art only started one out of the 5 World Series games, and that was against Jim Palmer, the right-hander. Shamsky was a left-handed hitter. But I think because of what happened with the 69 Mets, other teams then began using the platoon system. The great Yankee teams of the late 70s, they had Lou Piniella alternating with both Roy White and Reggie Jackson, the righty lefty switch. And so teams started to do that more and more. But it was not common in 1969.